The first words of humanity weren't poetry or philosophy. They were clay tablets from Sumer, before books, before paper, before even the alphabet that you and I are using right now. Humans found a way to scratch their thoughts into the world. And no, it wasn't poetry or philosophy. It was bookkeeping. Yes, the very first written words in human history were just a place list. In Mesopotamia, more than 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians built some of the world's first cities, Mulzers. To keep track of it all, they invented something extraordinary: cuneiform writing. Imagine this, a real consignation. But what did these first texts say? Not epics, not love letters. They said things like, Lug of Urum. Meanwhile, along the Nile, the Egyptians were developing their own script, hieroglyphs.
Hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs looked like little pictures, birds, eyes, hand. But here's the clever part.
Far to the east, another civilization gave writing a very different purpose. In ancient Yid, they carved questions into the bone. Will it rain tomorrow? If the king goes hunting, will he succeed? Finally, they carved the answers back onto the bone. It was half fortune-telling, half early database. In India, writing preserved something else: music and myth.
It's a collection of hymns to gods like Indra and Agni, sung for centuries before being written down in Sanskrit.
Imagine generations of priests chanting the same verses under the stars.
Thanks to that decision, we still have what might be called humanity's oldest surviving songbook.
So let's step back. The Sumerians wrote to manage debts. The Egyptians wrote to honor the gods.
The Chinese wrote to ask the spirits. The Indians wrote to preserve their sacred songs.
Different goals, different scripts, but one shared idea: the human need to remember, to explain, to pass.
When you picture writing, you probably think of pen and paper, or maybe a keyboard under your fingers. But the first writers had none of these. But the very first people to write didn't have pens. They didn't even have paper. Instead, they had something much more earthy: mud. Yes, the earliest writing system in history, cuneiform, was not written in ink, but pressed into clay tablets. And believe it or not, these little lumps of clay would carry humanity's first invoices, laws, love letters, and even literature. When you picture writing, you probably think of pen and paper, or maybe a keyboard. But the very first people to write, instead they had something much more earthy: mud. Yes, the earliest writing system was not written in ink, but pressed into clay tablets. And believe it or not, these little lumps of clay carried humanity's first invoices, laws, love letters, even literature. To write cuneiform, the Sumerians used the most common material around them: reeds. Now, imagine pressing that stylus into soft, damp clay. Each press leaves behind a small, wedge-shaped mark. In fact, the word cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. It's like stamping shapes into dough, but instead of baking cookies, you're recording history. Though, to be fair, the writing surface was just as humble. People shaped wet clay into flat tablets, roughly the size of a hand or a small book.
Clay was cheap, everywhere, and, most importantly, when dried or baked, it became nearly indestructible.
That's why we've discovered hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets today, while most close. Of course, not everyone could just start scribbling. Scribes trained for years in schools called eduba. One important detail: cuneiform was not drawn, it was pressed. The stylus was pushed into clay at different swip. Of course, not everyone could just start scribbling. Scribes trained for years in schools called eduba. So what did they write with these wedges? At first, lists, grain deliveries, beer rations, sheep inventory. One important detail: Cuneiform was not drawn, it was pressed. By combining wedge marks, scribes created symbols for objects, numbers, and sounds. At first, each symbol was a pictograph. A head meant man. A jar meant beer. Not everyone could write. Scribes trained for years in schools called eduba, or tablet houses. One student even wrote, "The teacher hit me because I didn't know my lesson." Proof that exams have been stressful for 5,000 years.
What did the Sumerians write? Lists, grain, beer rations, sheep. Workers even got paid in beer, literally, pints for wages.
Over time, cuneiform expanded. Letters, contracts, math tables, and eventually, literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh. For over 3,000 years, cuneiform was the international script, used by kinked, merchants, and priests across empires.
First last. One tablet from 1750 BC is the world's first customer complaint. Nani wrote, "The copper you sent me is bad."
So why does cuneiform matter? Because it was the first real system of writing, the foundation for everything that came after. It showed humanity that thoughts could be preserved, shared, and passed down, not just through memory, but through marks on a tablet. From debt lists to divine myths, from beer rations to laws, cuneiform turned fleeting words into permanent records. And thanks to mud and reeds, we can still read the voices of people who lived 5,000 years ago. When archaeologists uncovered thousands of tablets in Mesopotamia, they hoped for secrets, philosophy, maybe even early science fiction. But what did they actually find? Mostly paperwork, receipts, lists, and complaints. And honestly, that makes them even more fascinating, because they show us how ordinary people lived, worried, and argued 5,000 years ago. The earliest tablets are essentially shopping lists. One might say, so-and-so owes 5 sheeps, another. It sounds mundane, but these lists are gold for historians. They reveal not just what people ate and traded, but how their economy. Over time, clay tablets became the medium of law. Contracts, treaties, marriage agreements, all pressed into mud. Settlements. The most famous, of course, is the Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1750 BC. It includes nearly
Many are quite strict. If a builder builds a house and it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall pay.
Not all tablets were about debts and laws. Some were letters, real personal messages. Clay tablets also preserve some of the earliest mathematics. The Babylonians invented a base 60 system, why we still.
It tells of a mighty king, his friendship with Enkidu, and his search for immortality. But there are also myths, hymns, and prayers, tales of gods and monsters.
These texts show us not just how people lived, but what they dreamed, feared, and worshipped. What makes these tablets so powerful is not just the kings and epics, but the ordinary details.
We find medical prescriptions. If a man has toothache, let him chew on this herb. We find astronomical.
Taken together, they're like opening a time capsule. The grocery lists, the homework, the office emails, and the bedtime story. So, what did they write on clay tablets? They wrote everything. Their debts and their dreams. On the surface, many of the earliest records look boring. Lists of sheep, jars of beer, piles. That system worked. After all, the Rig Veda in India. With writing came the first codified laws. The Code of Hammurabi in Babylon was carved into.
Imagine living in a world where the law is whatever the king says at breakfast. Now imagine living in a.
Those dusty tablets weren't just about rations. They grew into stories, hymns, and eventually philosophy. Without cuneiform, we wouldn't have the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first epic in world literature.
Without hieroglyphs, we wouldn't know the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Without oracle bones, we wouldn't trace the evolution of Chinese philosophy. Every great tradition of literature and thought has roots in writing. Plato argued truth. Confucius debated virtue. Indian sages.
Writing also made complex societies possible. Think about it. You can't run an empire on memory alone. Taxes, trade, military supply lines, temple rituals. Without written records, chaos would reign. Writing turned cities into civilizations and rulers into emperors. One scholar joked, civilization began means. Writing created the first international diplomacy, the first global trade networks. It's like the ancient version of email.
Perhaps the most moving legacy of early writing is not the laws or the epics, but the little details of everyday life.
In other words, writing didn't just preserve kings and gods, it preserved people. Thanks to clay tablets, we know that a frustrated student once complained about his teacher, and that a copper buyer wrote a furious complaint about bad quality goods. So let's not underestimate those dry little tablets. From debt records came literature. From ration lists came law. Writing allowed humans to step out of the fog of memory and into the clarity of history. It gave us the... And here's the irony. Today, we worry about our digital files vanishing in 10 years. Yet the clay tablets They didn't have phones. They didn't have the internet. What they had were symbols carved into clay, papyrus, turtle shells, or palm leaves.
Each civilization found its own way to turn writing into a bridge. The Sumerians connected.
Interesting. The Indians connected humanity with the cosmos through sacred hymns. The Greeks connected communities through stories. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians invented cuneiform writing to keep track of trade. At first, it was simple lists. But soon, it expanded into letters, treaties, even literature. A merchant in Ur could write.
Writing turned oral agreements into binding contracts, and sometimes it became the medium of complaints, like the...
If Mesopotamians wrote to settle debts, the Egyptians wrote to connect with eternity. Hieroglyphs were considered a gift from the god Thoth. Every inscription in a tomb or temple was...
The most famous example is the Book of the Dead. Not one book, but a collection of hundreds of chapters.
Its purpose, to guide the soul through the dangers of the afterlife, from monsters to the... In Egypt, writing connected not just people, but people with gods. An inscription was a promise.
In the East, ancient China gave writing a unique role: divination. Around 1200 BC, they asked questions like, will it rain tomorrow? If the king hunts, will he succeed?
They heated the bones until cracks appeared, and priests read the cracks as messages from the heavens.
Finally, they carved both the questions and the answers onto the bones. This wasn't just superstition, it was politics. By consulting the heavens, rulers could The miracle is that these carved symbols became the direct ancestors of Chinese characters. So when someone writes sun or mountain today, they are directly connected to scratches carved on turtle shells 3,000 years ago.
In the Indian subcontinent, writing preserved something sacred, the Rig Veda.
Verses praising gods like Indra, Agni, and Varuna were sung for centuries before.
Unlike clay tablets or oracle bones, Rigveda shows writing as a tool to preserve music, faith, and philosophy. In the Mediterranean, ancient Greece used writing to bind its people together through stories.
Later, writing preserved the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides. Citizens gathered in theater. In Greece, writing wasn't just memory, it was community identity. The Hebrews used writing to preserve the Hebrew Bible, laying the foundation for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, found near the Dead Sea, show us how religious communities 2,000 years ago
Erased in trade states. Meanwhile, Rome used Latin writing to connect an empire, from Britain to Egypt.
If Egypt used writing to talk to the gods, Rome used it to govern the world.
A Sumerian student once scribbled, "The teacher beat me because I didn't know my lesson."
A Babylonian buyer once complained about bad copper. Basically, the world's first one-star review.
The Egyptians buried travel guides for the afterlife. Basically, ancient Google Maps for eternity.
Sumerians used writing for debts and trade. Clay tablets recorded barley, beer, and sheep, the paperwork of civilization's dawn. Egyptians used writing for prayers to the gods. Hieroglyphs were sacred words carved into temples and tombs.
Egyptians used writing for prayers to the gods. Hieroglyphs were sacred words carved into temples and tombs.
In India, writing preserved cosmic hymns. The Rig Veda carried sacred chants across millennia. The Greeks wrote epics and theater. Stories of heroes and tragedies united entire communities. Hebrews used writing for religion. Romans used it for law. Different scripts, one shared desire.
Writing turned memory into history, stories into heritage, fleeting voices into civilization.
And thanks to these writings, whether in Europe, India, or anywhere else, we still hear the voices of our ancestors across millennia. But if we look closer at the clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and inscriptions left behind, another story emerges.
Students and their homework.
Merchants haggling over bad deals.
Doctors prescribing herbs.
Do not be arrogant because of your knowledge.
Thanks to ancient writing, we don't just know about empires and wars. We know how ordinary people lived, worried, and laughed. First stop, the classroom. In Mesopotamia, young scribes trained in schools called eduba. First stop, the classroom. In Mesopotamia, young scribes trained in schools called eduba, literally tablet houses. And yes, just like today's students, they weren't always happy about it. One clay tablet. Next, let's step into the marketplace. Clay tablets preserve trade agreements, receipts, and contracts from ancient. Around 1750 BC, Nani wrote angrily to Anasir, "The copper you sent me is bad. I will not accept." One prescription reads, "If a man has toothache, let him chew on this herb." Another suggests using beer mixed with certain plants as medicine. Cloches. Of course, not all treatments were purely scientific. Some combined magic and ritual. Say this incantation. It may sound strange, but these were the first steps toward organized medicine. And honestly, given how expensive, clay and papyrus also carried advice. what we might call self-help books of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, we find collections of proverbs. Do not neglect your mother, so that your God will leave us. In Egypt, the instructions of Ptahhotep offered wisdom to young men. Do not be arrogant because of your knowledge. Sound advice, still relevant today. In fact, much of this wisdom feels timeless, reminding us. Writing also captured the voices of families and lovers. In Egypt, letters survive. Some are surprisingly romantic. An Egyptian love poem says, "Your love has captured my heart, like the..."
Not everything was love letters and wisdom. Some tablets show the daily grind of math.
Students practiced multiplication and geometry. One tablet even lists Pythagorean triples, over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Other tablets record eclipses, star charts, and planetary movements. Babylonian scribes carried what did people actually eat? Writing tells us. Ration tablets list daily allowances for workers.
Tablets. Yes, onions were a staple, alongside bread, dates, fish, and of course beer. So when
Believe it or not, some ancient writings describe entertainment. In Mesopotamia, we find rules for board games like the royal game of Ur.
Clay tablets preserve. Clay tablets are how the game was played, including moves and strategies.
One even reads like a farmer's lament. The locusts have eaten the barley. The storehouses are empty. What makes these everyday writings so powerful is their humanity. We can hear the frustration of a student scolded for messy hands.
We can hear the tenderness of a husband missing his wife.
We can hear the laughter of children playing a board game. History is often told through kings and wars.
So, what do ancient everyday writings teach us? That 5,000 years ago, humans weren't so different from us. They wrote love notes, grocery lists, and angry reviews.
They tried to make sense of the stars, of sickness, of each other.
Their writing didn't just preserve civilizations, it preserved people. Not just the mighty, but the ordinary. And that is the magic of ancient writing. It lets us laugh, sigh, and sympathize with voices. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets, the very first writings of humanity, were not just a few marks pressed into clay.
They were the dawn of civilization.
The doorway through which mankind stepped into history.
And from here, our story truly begins.
If you enjoyed this, follow the channel to explore the next chapters.
Before books, before paper, before even the alphabet that you and I are using right now, humans found a way to scratch their thoughts into the world. Before books, before paper, before even the alphabet that you and I are using right now, humans found a way to scratch their thoughts into the world.